welcome to Mental Illness Unknown. I'm Jada Crawford, and I'll be your host today. In this episode of Mental Illness Unknown, we're going to talk about the criminal justice system and the effects it has on mental health and those with mental illnesses. We will be asking the questions, how does the criminal justice system treat those with mental illness? And should mentally ill people be held accountable for their actions? And if so, how do we hold them accountable while taking their mental illnesses into question?
Hi, I'm Jessica Anderson. When reading about the criminal justice system from Bryan Stevenson, so many emotions and questions flew into our minds. What especially intrigued us, though, was mental illness. I feel this is a topic not talked about enough when it comes down to the prison system. To hear the following stories that Stevenson shares with us within his book, Just Mercy, was an eye-opener. These mentally ill people being put into prison rather than receiving the correct help, or even those gaining these mental illnesses due to their treatment within prison, is just awful. We decided to look more into this and found many disturbing facts and statistics. This discrimination has always been around and still is, till this day.
Okay, so what I want to discuss is how the criminal justice system treats those with mental illness. So, to start, let me define what I mean when I say mental illness. I mean more than depression and anxiety. I'm also talking about those with psychotic disorders like schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder, or psychopaths and sociopaths, as well as those with developmental disorders and PTSD or complex PTSD. Now, I would like to bring up a specific case of Bryan Stevenson's. A man named Joe Sullivan was convicted of rape of an older woman at 13 years old. Now, he was 13 and reading at a first grade reading level. The way this came about, Joe had been convinced by a few of his older friends to rob a house. Now, his friends took some jewelry and some cash, and then they left. Later that afternoon, the older woman came back, and she was attacked and raped by several men. She never saw their faces, she only ever heard their voices. A few hours later, Joe and one of his friends had been picked up by the police and found a few of the older woman's jewelry on Joe's friend. Unfortunately, Joe was the only one convicted of the rape, even though one of the boys had in his history accounts of violent acts against others. Joe's lawyer had failed to bring up the fact that he was mentally incompetent, and so he was sentenced to life without parole. Now, Joe's case is one of the only cases where a 13-year-old was sentenced to life without parole with a crime not involving a killing. And while in prison, he was sexually assaulted and abused to the point where he ended up paralyzed and in a wheelchair. Years later, he wrote a letter to Bryan Stevenson and asked him for help. Now, when Bryanson described the letter, that he described the handwriting as though it had been written by a child. So he decided to go and visit him, and when he did, he found Joe in a metal cage. And the guards were unable to get him out because his wheelchair had gotten stuck on the sides of the cage. The guards had discussed a few different ways to get him out, such as tilting the entire cage on its side to be able to pull him out. Eventually, they had a few of the other inmates to help get Joe out of the cage. Now, the entire time, Joe could be heard moaning and whimpering in obvious discomfort. When Stevenson asked one of the guards why he was locked in a cage, the guard responded with, quote unquote, "Lifer. All lifers have to be moved with higher security protocols." Now, this was a grown man with the mental capabilities of a child, and he had been locked in a cage because of a sentencing he received for a crime he did not commit. Now, thankfully, Stevenson was able to convince the court to overturn his sentencing 25 years after Joe had been sentenced to life without parole. Now, during the trial, Bryan Stevenson argued that the United States was one of the only countries in the world that sentenced children to life without parole.
Greetings everyone, my name is Oceana Tao, and today we have a special guest. Our special guest will explain how many people are affected by mental health due to the criminal justice system. Please welcome our very well guest, Bob.
Hello everyone, my name is Bob. It's good to be here. I am a therapist for prison mates. Yes, with how Ocean had said, it is unfair that the criminal justice system is towards the minorities. People in prison are heavily affected by it. About almost 50% of people in prison have a disorder of mental health, and this is all due to the trauma in prison that they each go through. In the book, Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, he stated in his book how a teenager named Joe was sentenced to an adult prison where he was repeatedly raped and sexually assaulted. Doctors later concluded that his neurological disorder might have been triggered by trauma in prison. The evidence is one of the many ways how people in prison develop a sort of mental health issue. In prison, I have heard countless stories of people wishing they were out of prison because of the things they have gone through from other inmates and security guards have done. Okay, but how does the criminal justice system play a role in their mental health? The audience is aware of what can be causes for mental health in prison, Bob, but how does the criminal justice play a role in it? Well, as I said, the criminal justice system plays a major role in mental health for people in prison because most people in prison are accused of crimes they have not committed, one of it being black people. African American, also known as black people, for the longest time have been accused for crimes they have not committed and was sentenced for an execution or lifetime in prison. The social justice system plays a big role for those in prison due to the unfairness in trials and the trauma that those people will go through during imprisonment. Another evidence that I have found in being a therapist in prison for many years is about an average of 27,200 people in just a year have been sent to prison for crimes that they did not commit. And this is all due to a lack of accountability for police and prosecutors, reliance on junk science and mistaken eyewitnesses, and the indigent defense crisis that are major contributors to wrongful convictions that have undermined the credibility of our system and ruined the lives of innocent men and women. This clearly states from a source and from being a therapist that because people are being wrongfully accused of crimes they did not commit, the wrongful convictions from the social justice will affect those that are going to be imprisonment, and the lives of innocent people are not going to be prepared for what will happen in prison, as prison is one of the things that lead to the trauma and mental health that will happen to those people in prison.
And I am Jacob Villanueva. I would like to furthermore discuss the flaws of the criminal justice system and the effects it has on those with mental illnesses, as well as the criminal justice system itself, and how it affects those people's mental health. I would first like to give a real-life example of this from a book I read called Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson in my English class. Herbert Richardson was a Vietnam veteran who was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death following the killing of an 11-year-old girl. This leads on to my next topic of my personal experience when it comes to, just the importance of mental health. There was a time earlier in my life when I was, very depressed and I was just going down the wrong path. And, I made the decision to really get the help that I needed. And, it's sad to see that, many men, they struggle with mental health issues and, they don't get the help that they need. And many times this leads to suicide. And, if they were to just speak up, this could save a lot of people's lives. And my mom, she's a therapist, and she works with patients with mental illnesses. And she tells me all the time, that they're trapped in their head, and they can't seem to get out of it. And that's how I was for a minute, but I was able to dig out of the hole that I was in, and I couldn't have done it without the help that I got. And I truly believe that that's the main flaw when it comes to the juvenile system. I mean, can you imagine these young inmates sentenced to 10, 20 years? And, if they're not given a second chance to, be able to heal, or better yet, be looked at for the issues that they have going on, they're just sentenced to death row for, a crime that they committed. And, I truly believe that there could be justice there if they were to just, receive help and get a second chance for their issues, and really, possibly recover from what's going on inside of their brain.
An example of mental illness before prison without any proper treatment would be the case of Trina Garnett. Trina is a girl who was charged with second-degree murder at the age of 14 and was tried as an adult in court. Growing up in her household, no one was safe. Her mother, 11 siblings, and herself were abused by her alcoholic father. Even their pet dog was in danger of being killed and thrown out of the window by her father. The children would watch as their father would strip their mother, beat her, and even rape her. Many of the children were born from these rapings. All of the abuse and pregnancies caused their mother to get very sick, dying when Trina was only 9 years old. This is when Trina started to show signs of mental illness, such as having low IQ, suffering from speech barriers, and even other disabilities. Many of these were from the trauma of the physical abuse she grew up with. Even just seeing it or receiving it. She had been sexually abused and victimized by many adults and teens while she was homeless after running away with her twin sisters. There was a time where she consumed lighter fluid when she was without parental supervision. Another time where she was set on fire, causing her to be burned and severely scarred. These events also contributed to her trauma and mental illnesses. But even with the signs of mental disabilities in Trina, she was never received proper help due to the poverty reasons. Even when she was arrested, she was denied any medical treatment for her physical trauma nor her mental trauma. One late night in August 1976, Frances Newsome, Trina's 16-year-old friend, and Trina Garnett, the 14-year-old girl, decided to sneak into the house of boys they wanted to talk to. These boys were forbidden from being friends with Trina, which caused them to be so sneaky. In order to see around the house, Trina lit a match to find her ways to the boys. This is when she accidentally set the home on fire, causing the two boys to die in their sleep from suffocation due to the smoke. The trauma from the event caused Trina to be unable to speak. Even with these disabilities, unable to even form the intent murder, she was charged for the crime. The court decided to ignore the fact that she was unable to stand trial due to her inability to speak. When being imprisoned, she was 15 years old, denied any medical help for her physical injuries, as well as her mental disabilities. Shortly after being in prison, she was raped by a male prison guard who impregnated her, yet she never received any medical care, even during the 30 years of her prison life. In the article Sticks and Stones, the jailing of mentally ill kids, the authors state that across the country each year 1 million kids come into contact with the juvenile justice system, and many more are sent to the locked residential treatment centers. More than 90% are held for nonviolent offenses. The U.S. Department of Justice estimates that 60% have recognizable mental disorders and that as many as 200,000 are seriously mentally ill. This shows the horrible discrimination against those with mental impairments. Mentally ill people don't get the treatment that they need when in prison. In fact, many of them are in prison due to their mental illness. This mistreatment is not moral and needs to be changed. These aren't just some made-up stories, but real-life situations that have happened to human beings. The prison system has not only mistreated the mentally ill, but also created them.